In Chapter 7, what we try to do is take the information presented in Chapters 5 and 6 and synthesize them into a sort of comprehensive model of individual informing. Then when we go on to Chapter 8, we talk a little bit more about informing as it involves groups and crowds. So, an overview of Chapter 7 begins with introducing what I refer to as the individual resonance model of information processing that's based on an earlier bias filter model. Then we look at some of the different filters that interfere with our ability to inform. Attention filters, information filters, the cognitive filters, filters that are based upon our risk and time preferences, filters that deal with the emotional impact of the informing that's going on. And then we summarize this in terms of the success framework presented by Chip and Dan Heath in Made to Stick. Before we turn to the specific model, what I'd like to do is introduce the concept of resonance. When you talk to researchers, very often they seem focused on two aspects of their research. Is it rigorous and is it relevant? Now, if we look at rigor, rigor can be defined as information being credible. It's been subjected to objective testing and so forth. That's what makes a piece of research or an assertion rigorous. When we talk about relevance, we talk about the topic being important to the clients that we want to inform. The clients are motivated to learn about the topic. And the question then becomes, well, is this enough? And I would argue that it really isn't, because neither rigor nor relevance really deal with the question of whether the message is going to get to the client in a way that produces the intended changes. So I have introduced the notion of resonance. And what resonance means is that the message is composed in a way that it reaches the client without undue attenuation, which means loss of information or distortion, the wrong information coming in. Also, if the message is interesting, and what I would argue is that if we want our research to have impact, rigor and relevance are not enough. What we need is additional resonance to make sure that the message gets across. And this is one of the reasons why I believe it is a mistake to separate out the notion of doing research with the notion of actually diffusing that research to practice, because I believe you have to look at the two as being inseparable and all part of research. As a way of thinking about resonance, I introduced a model called the individual resonance model, which is based on an earlier model called the bias filter model. And the basic idea here is the way we often think about informing is, we've got a sender, we've got a filters, and then it goes all the way to the client's knowledge. And we don't really worry what happens within the client's mind before we reach that knowledge interpretation. And in this particular model, as long as we send the message, we don't have to worry too much about it being received. What I would argue is that this is really not a good idea. In fact, a nice way of thinking about this, and I call this a conceptual scheme, not a theory, because I don't believe the mind is really organized like this. I think this is just a convenient way of organizing our information or the way we think about the mind. But is to imagine the information entering the client's mind is going through a series of filters. And the first of these filters is attention. If the client is not paying attention, then there is no way that that message is going to get through. You can speak to someone who's asleep as much as you want. Chances are, if they don't wake up, they're not going to receive your message. Something we demonstrate time and time again in our lectures. After the attention, we get an information filter as the individuals attempt to determine the degree to which that knowledge fits the existing information that they have. And they try to integrate it into that existing information. After that, they hit risk and time and cognitive filters. These are filters that basically look for inconsistencies either with our preferences or with existing knowledge. Beyond that, we go through motivation filters, which is to say, do we really care about this? Do we want to take the effort to pay attention to it long enough to allow it to be moved into memory? And visceral factors. These are things like our emotional state and so forth. And what you will notice here is that I suggest the filters may operate at different levels. Information filters can go all the way to the compiled level, as well as affecting the other levels of knowledge, because basically if we've already got a slot for the information, we can incorporate it without even thinking about it. When we drive, we're constantly receiving information, but that information is consistent with our long practice history of the laws of physics and the laws of motion and so forth, so we don't think about it. We simply react to it without any conscious effort. As we move to risk and time and cognitive filters, this requires a little bit more attention. This doesn't really work at the compiled level, and involves like our structures, our knowledge structures, as well as discrete concepts. And as we move to motivation and visceral factors, we're more focused on the sort of specific implications as opposed to incorporating it into existing knowledge structures. Oversimplification to be sure, but it's just kind of a convenient way of thinking about these things. What I'll do now is take you through some examples that deal with the different levels. And the first level we'll look at involves something known as the information processing inverted U-curve. And it basically measures informing effectiveness versus the rate of information flow. And we call it the inverted U-curve because it looks a little bit like an upside-down U. And essentially what this tells us is that if we're informing at a very, very low rate, we've got a low information flow, our informing is not very effective. And the reason for this is we tend to lose the client's attention. And if we're not giving them enough information to hold their attention, then they get distracted and they think about something else. On the other hand, if we give them too much information flow, we get a different problem, information overload. And essentially when information overload occurs, basically people stop paying attention, and because they simply are not able to process the information that we're feeding them. So there's this kind of sweet spot, and of course where the sweet spot exists depends upon an individual's level of expertise. If someone is incredibly expert, they can often handle a much higher rate of information flow before overload occurs. I recall one course that I took at MIT. It was an introduction to computer systems, and by the time I'd taken that course, I'd had relatively little formal training in computer systems, but I had been programming for 5 years, pretty much full time, and had a lot of experience in that. And that course was incredibly challenging for many of the students taking it, whereas for me, every time the person mentioned a concept, I had encountered a problem that particular concept, such as creating a hash table or using an SQL database, would have solved. And so I probably learned more in that course than I've ever learned in any other course in my life, despite the fact that it was a lecture course. But the reason was the rate of information flow was perfectly matched with my existing level of knowledge. And frankly, that doesn't happen that often. Unless you think that this is too conceptual, there's some very practical examples of attention filters. For example, Daniel Ariely reported a study where a teenage driver driving alone was 40% more likely to get into an accident than with an adult. But when another teenager was in the car, the percentage was twice that, and with a third teenager along, the percentage doubled again. So what we see is that distraction can have a major impact on our ability to process information. Another famous example is what's known as the Stroop effect. And the Stroop effect typically involves displaying words and colors that are inconsistent. And what we find is that if you write the word blue in blue, it's very, very easy for people to keep track of that and recall it. If you write green, on the other hand, in red or some other color, we process that information much more slowly. Once again, these are examples of how our ability to pay attention impacts our ability to process information. Our information filter is designed to provide us with some shortcuts such that we look at information, and if it fits a particular pattern or if we've seen it before, we don't bother dealing with it carefully. We just move it right into storage. So, for example, if you read the sentence above quickly, what you might not notice is the fact that the word "the" is repeated twice. Another example of this is context. The phrase "time flies like an arrow" is well known in artificial intelligence because when you first see it, you normally look at it as some sort of philosophical statement about time, analogous to, say, time flies when you're having fun. But you feed this into a computer parser and you get a bunch of other possibilities as well that we don't see as humans, because our information filter essentially picks the one based upon the most appropriate context. So, for example, time flies like an arrow could be equivalent to some breed of fly, like the fruit fly, loving arrows in particular, analogous to fruit flies like a banana. It could also be an instruction to someone who is timing flies in a race, and the instructions are: time these flies the same way you would time an arrow, similarly to time hurdlers the way you would time sprinters. And then finally, the most bizarre interpretation: time flies using the method an arrow would. In other words, imagine that an arrow would use a stopwatch, then you should essentially use a stopwatch to time your flies as well. That one's pretty hard to pick out, but in fact the computer has no trouble picking it out because there is considerable ambiguity here. And our information filter can be very effective in preventing us from having to deal with these obviously unintended interpretations. Cognitive filters apply things like heuristic and reasoning to attempt to come up with solutions that are not immediately recalled. So, for example, the question has been asked: what city has more inhabitants, San Diego or San Antonio? And there was a study done by a German, and what they found was that most U.S. students get the answer correct, but far from all. On the other hand, 100% of German students got the answer correct. Now, the reason they got the answer correct is what's known as the availability heuristic. Germans don't really know anything or that much about San Diego, but they haven't even heard of San Antonio. So as a consequence, since they'd heard of San Diego and they hadn't heard of San Antonio, they decided San Diego must have the larger population. And this is the type of reasoning that can take place at the cognitive filter, which can actually have quite an impact on how information is interpreted. Our risk and time preference filters determine the likelihood that we'll accept information or trade-offs based upon our perceptions of the associated risk and time. And so an example of this, and there are lots and lots of examples in Kahneman's book, involves a set of choices. So in choice 1, you get a 50% chance of winning a 3-week tour of the UK, France, and Italy, or a 100% chance of a 1-week tour of the UK. This was given to UK students. The second choice, you had a 5% chance of winning the 3-week tour of the UK, France, and Italy, and a 10% chance of winning a 1-week tour of the UK. Now, what they found when they did these choices was that for the first choice, 22% chose the first option, 78% chose the second. This is an example of how we strongly prefer certainty to uncertainty. Since there's uncertainty here, we have a preference. Now, for the second choice, 67% chose the first option, whereas 33% chose the second. Now, the ratio of uncertainty is the same in both cases. In this case, it's 2 to 1, and in this case, it's 2 to 1. But a rational decision maker would therefore have tended to choose the same option in both. But in fact, people choose very differently because we don't see the difference between 5 and 10% as being nearly that great as the difference between certainty and anything less than certainty. When we get to motivation filters, there are a lot of different sources of motivation. Intrinsic motivation consists of things like keeping arousal within reasonable bounds, the desire for control, the desire for achievement, and it's one of my favorite articles is an article by Davis from 1971 called "That's Interesting," and I love this particular statement, which you can read it on the screen, but basically says that what makes us interested in something is if it represents an incremental variation from what we know, but not a large variation. As soon as we propose a large variation, we're going to end up being called crackpots. And he argues this is the reason that genius has always been considered close to madness. And returning back to our fitness landscape, what in a sense this says is that we're always interested in ways of improving fitness involving an incremental change, but we're not necessarily that interested in ways that require us to move to an entirely different fitness peak. As I mentioned on the previous slide, one of the primary sources of motivation, the intrinsic motivation, is the sense of being in control. And this is illustrated by a very famous experiment conducted by Roden and Langer that was performed in a nursing home. And what they did was they gave each resident a plant. And for one set of residents, they were told that they had to take complete responsibility for taking care of the individual plant, and if they didn't, it would simply die. The other half, the low control group, was told a staff person would take care of it, and they would not have to worry about it. Well, the implications of this little change were quite remarkable because at the end of the 6-month study, 30% of the low control group had died compared with 15% of the high control group. I'm not exactly sure how you would get this through an institutional review board today when the result of being in one of the groups was a higher death rate, but what this basically tended to do was confirm a study that when you give people responsibility, they do better in every respect. And this is just an illustration of the power of motivation and of giving people control, which has important implications for informing, since when you use certain techniques for informing, such as lectures, what happens is the individual client doesn't really have a sense of control, whereas if you engage them in their education, they are likely to have a much higher sense of control, and that will help move the information through that motivation filter. Another motivation effect can be found in the area of goal-setting theory, which is one of the most researched and probably most successful areas of management theory. And basically what goal-setting theory says is that you can dramatically improve performance by giving individual goals, but the goals have to have certain specific characteristics. They have to be specific, because specific goals tend to outperform vague goals or no goals. They have to be committable. The individual has to have a sense of commitment, and not only does this increase performance, but can lead to what's known as the escalating commitment effect, which is to say, the longer you hold a goal and the more you move towards a goal, the more committed to that goal you become. And this is another version of proximity, which is we tend to do better when we see progress being made, sometimes referred to as the endowed progress effect. So we become more committed when we see progress being made. And difficulty improves a goal up to a point, as long as the goal remains achievable and as long as the goal is not avoidable. In other words, if you can get out of a particular goal, then difficulty does not necessarily increase your commitment to it. And this is a little bit like that notion of the inverted U. If you have a goal that's too easy, you don't perform that well, you kind of ignore it. If you have a goal that's too hard, then you ignore it. You need that sweet spot. But as long as you're within that sweet spot, if you increase difficulty, you can increase performance. Finally, there is participation. And what's interesting here is it turns out involvement in setting the goal matters a lot less than we might expect. There's a long line of theory which suggests that having users setting their own goals will have a big beneficial effect, but that is not clearly indicated in the research. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. It simply means that we didn't find it in the research, because one of the things that frequently happens when we do the research is we try to oversimplify the questions. But goal-setting theory is, a fertile area for research, and it's an area of management research which has actually shown to be pretty robust in practice. The visceral filters essentially deal with emotion-related effects on information processing, and a number of these effects have been observed in general terms, though frankly the stories told about them are not that compelling. So, processing priority. What we find is that if we have a lot of emotional cues in the information we're transferring, we tend to have a higher rate of memory, and they tend to get our attention better. Enhanced memory of emotionally significant events. Things like the Challenger disaster tend to sort of heighten our awareness, and so we tend to remember where we were when we got that news. And so emotionally significant events can have a significant impact on our retention. What we also find is that if you recall emotion-laden events, it can affect the decision-making, so that in some cases just recalling an emotionally significant event can change the way we process information. So these are kind of cognitive psychology findings. As I say, the stories are not as compelling, but I talk about them a little bit more in the book if you're interested in. As you may recall, Chip and Dan Heath, in their book Made to Stick, proposed a success model that if you want to communicate in a sticky way, it has to be simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional, and revolve around a story. And what I would argue here is that this particular framework actually works pretty well in the context of this individual resonance model. So if we take a look at simple and unexpected, both of these tend to involve the degree to which the message captures our attention. If we talk about concrete, here we're talking about something that's going to get us through the information filter. When we talk about credible, we're dealing with our cognitive filters and our risk filters. We basically have faith in the message. We talk about emotional, we're talking about our visceral and motivational filters. And then stories have a particularly impressive resonance that kind of goes across the board. The thing about stories is stories include their own embedded links. When we talked about what allows us to save information, one of the things we talked about is the more links that exist, the better. And stories, by virtue of their narrative form, already have a lot of their own embedded links, which allows us to bring them in more effectively than almost anything else. And there's a lot of evidence out there in the management literature and other literatures that suggest that telling stories is a particularly effective way of achieving informing. So to summarize quickly what we talked about in Chapter 7, rigor and relevance are really not enough to ensure informing. We need this notion of resonance, the ability to move through the client's filters if we want our message to get through. If we take a look at the client as having a series of filters, each one of them has certain characteristics. The attention and information filters tend to use the information we already know in sort of screening the new message that's coming in. The cognitive and risk time filters employ heuristics to try to simplify what we're doing and also determine if that message coming through is credible. Our motivation and visceral filters really depend a lot on how we're feeling, and what that means is our feelings and our motivation have a big impact in our ability to become informed as a client. And finally, stories are a particularly resonant form of informing, and therefore the use of stories should be encouraged when you're actually trying to get a message that is going to resonate with and stay with the client.